Are we live,
We're
Chris?
live. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, good morning. So welcome to the second Policy and Personnel Committee meeting. I'm Deborah Brooks, the chair. With me are my committee members, Dr. Shields, various members of the Boards of Education. Cynthia is here, and we'd like to begin. So Dr. Shields, with that, would you like to proceed to the agenda?
Of course. Thank you very much. So the first item on the agenda is just to review and accept the minutes from our September 16th meeting that we had. Those were sent in advance to all committee members. Are there any revisions to them or any questions about them?
No.
Okay. Then we will just accept the minutes as they were posted and distributed. Thank you, Cindy. Personnel update. I wanted to share a few items with you. The staff developer position that was established is something that we are still in search of. We've gone to a second round of search on that. And I will bring to you a candidate if we find a successful one in the near future. Number two, the Associate Administrator of Data Management and Supervision. We've had 3 finalists met with a joint committee of teachers and administrators. So I should have a debrief with them tomorrow or the next day to give you feedback on where we are in that search process. So that's coming to fruition. Number 3, I just wanted to share with you that, with the ongoing issue around having to quarantine or having to, monitor your health symptoms at home among staff, we continue to have to, fill those positions with substitutes. That's not always easy in these times, but we continue to be vigilant about adding to our sub list on each of the board agendas. But I just want to let you know that that is becoming harder as the times get more complicated with health issues among our staff. The next item on the agenda is policy 2450. The next 3 items on the agenda are topics that we reviewed in the spring that we're just trying to bring closure to. So why don't we start with 2450, which is policy on revision and policy revision and review. The edits, Ms. Epstein, did you have a question?
I did have a quick question. I noticed that we included both policy 2450 for review and I think 2460. And this falls under the heading of policies in the 2400 realm. Is there any reason why we wouldn't put these all together in a master policy instead of separating them out?
There's no direction either way, one way or the other, but they've been separate in the past, so we've just kept them separate. No one has ever suggested that we bring them together.
They do seem to overlap a bit. Some of it's a little redundant.
Can I make a suggestion then? That I know, Dr. Shields, you're trying to get rid of things that we had on the agenda from last year, but maybe with what Julie's pointing out, maybe we can put all 4 of those together. There's 4, I think, that kind of overlap, and bring it to another meeting where they're combined, or maybe have someone in your look at them and see what's redundant and combine them. And there is no reason to have, I think, 4 different ones other than it was like that in the past.
Okay, so could you just be specific on the 4 that you would like us to combine?
Julie, do you have the numbers?
I do. It's 2400, 2410, 2450, and 2460. Let me just concur that I'm correct in all those numbers. So I said 2400, I guess 2410, 2450, and 2460. I guess 2430 includes suspension of policies, so you should probably include that as well.
So it's the board's preference that we try and see if there's a way to merge all 5 policies. Is that what I'm hearing?
Julie,
My recommendation is to try and merge them into one policy and reduce the redundancy also. So it would be a centralized way on just basically how we handle all of our policies.
if it's possible, if the attorneys can find some symmetry amongst the policies. But I agree with getting rid of the redundancies. I actually had a lot of cross outs on my draft, so, okay.
Okay, we can bring those 5 policies back at a future meeting.
Deborah, Larry has a comment. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't see, I'm sorry, Larry.
That's okay. Last year, I know we were talking about trying to get the NISBA policy book and sort of merge it with ours and stuff like that. So we may want to see if we're still going in that direction. We may want to see if they have these as separate policies, because if we're going to be using a policy service to give us updates and stuff, it would be nice if their numbers sort of aligned with our numbers and we didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time. In concept, it's great, but we don't want to necessarily be putting ourselves in a big bind later. And perhaps they are all merged already in their service. And as I guess it's in board docs, eventually that's all going to merge in, I believe, right? Or at least that was our plan as of last year before the pandemic.
Yeah, good. That's a good observation, Larry, and a good point.
I agree. So then the direction should be to cross-reference with NISBA and see how they have aligned these various different policies and be consistent with what they have.
Right, at least in terms of numbering, we may change to make things ours as we have it, but we don't want to be too far off of their sequences. Understood. I think.
Understood. And just for the people who are listening on live stream, the policies are up on our agenda on board docs, so you can follow along from home. Actually, the policies we're discussing today, and if there are any policies that you wanted to review on your own at some point, all of the policies are listed under the Board of Ed policy tab. Okay. So.
All right. The next policy was policy 5129. It's entitled Academic Integrity. We discussed this last spring, and it was brought to a public board meeting for a first reading. At that public board meeting, it was pulled from the agenda because Mr. Greenstein felt that there was some wording lacking from the policy around the issue, I believe it was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on my memory, but I believe it was the fact that the policy didn't talk about knowingly plagiarizing, knowingly versus unknowingly plagiarizing.
Right. That was, there was based upon the fact that the way the policy reads, if I'm working on a test and somebody walks past my desk and looks down and sees that I said something on something and I have no idea they even did that because I'm concentrating on my test, I am guilty. I am as guilty of plagiarism as they are, which I feel is, that probably wouldn't happen in practice, but we do want our policy to reflect what will actually happen in the buildings.
So is the goal here then to review the policy from the beginning as though we're looking at it freshly, or is it to Rachel saying she has a comment? Okay, I'll have Rachel go ahead. I'll stop. Go ahead, Rachel.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Sorry, I had to call in today. First of all, what's the number on the policy? Because I'm pulling it up on my phone and I don't see it. I thought you said 5110.
5129.
Oh, sorry, 5129. Okay. So, but I remember discussing this. I just want to add to Larry's point that I think that we've had some confusion in the past about plagiarism. My understanding, the definition of plagiarism does not include somebody who was copied off anyway. So maybe we need to be clear somehow in how we're dealing with these circumstances. I agree with Larry. intent absolutely matters. Somebody that someone copies off is not guilty of something if they don't know and they're not helping. But I think that that person's not a plagiarist anyway.
Well, although this was based on a real, on a real event where there was some question as to whether the person's intent, whether the person had intent, and it was deemed that even though they didn't necessarily have intent, they were still guilty. So, that's sort of the reason that brought it up. It was based on an actual fact pattern that we dealt with last year.
I just want to say, Emily.
Larry, I totally agree with you. I'm just saying, I think we need to deal with it somehow, because I agree with you. I agreed with you then. I agree with you now that somebody who did not knowingly do it, was not part of it, did not have the intent to let somebody plagiarize off them should not be penalized. I'm just saying we have to be careful with our language, because I believe that the definition of plagiarism really only covers the person who does the plagiarizing. You are not a plagiarist if somebody copies off you.
And that's clear in the policy. There's a definition for what plagiarism is.
Then that's not clear in the practice, because we've been interpreting that differently, that both parties so then we have to be very specific that plagiarism is defined to the person doing the copying, not the person who is copied from. But then there could be a person who actually shows their paper to somebody else. They're not the person who's doing the copying, but they are a knowing and willing participant in the plagiarism scheme. So, I think we sort of I think the whole thing does hinge on intent,
Yep.
rather than on action.
Okay, Emily had a comment?
I'm just saying that we're now starting a conversation again about what is plagiarism and what is academic integrity, which I believe we did do last year. I think Larry's point for asking the policy to be taken off first reading and have it was to actually add the word knowingly, as opposed to I think he was trying to make a point about if a student knows that they're doing this. In other words, when it says plagiarism consists of copying, it could be plagiarism consists of knowingly copying, summarizing, or paraphrasing. And I think that's what Larry was trying to point out. I think the question then becomes overall, what is knowingly, right? And that is, I think, the philosophical discussion of intent. How do you prove someone knew they were doing something? But I think that was the point that Larry was trying to make. I don't think we should get back into a conversation again about academic integrity, but I think we should more try to maybe fix the language a little bit on if we can fine tune it to make Larry feel a little better about it.
Well, if anybody else doesn't have any comments, I actually had some fine tuning that I had written down on my draft. But I wanted to start actually with the top paragraph on the third line, where it talks about their own work for class assignments, quizzes and tests, reports and projects. I wanted to add and homework. Does anybody have any problem with that?
Oh, is that a class assignment or no? I mean, I don't care.
Well, I understand a class assignment is to be something they're doing in the classroom.
All right.
So I didn't know if it was different.
I don't mind the redundancy if there is any, or the overlap, but that's fine.
Okay. So cheating consists of referring to unauthorized instead of notes. I thought materials, because materials is all encompassing. It's broader than notes.
Okay.
During a quiz, test, or examination, because examination seems to be broken out further below. So I don't know if there's a difference, but an examination I think should be in there as part of cheating. And then at the end of that, number 1, and/or electronic. I don't know what encryptions means, but I thought unauthorized websites, because we're encountering that now in real time, where kids are going to unauthorized websites during tests.
I actually think it's just even websites during tests. They're consulting other electronic platforms, right?
Okay. So what would you say? Because I didn't really understand encryptions. I don't know what that means. But so are you saying, Julie, and or unauthorized websites or websites?
I just would put websites, I wouldn't clarify it as authorized or unauthorized, because I think if you're consulting during a test or, I mean,
Well, some kids, sometimes it's an open book and the kids, I don't know what the teachers might allow. That's why I thought unauthorized.
Doesn't unauthorized
would you say
modify it?
Just a moment.
Sorry.
or unauthorized online access or unauthorized internet access? Perhaps because
that's
you're not
better.
necessarily talking about websites, like unauthorized internet access.
Okay,
Yeah, that's better.
good. Okay.
I'm
Cynthia,
sorry.
you got that?
Could we go back to the prior paragraph where it was cheating?
Sure.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, what is the wording there?
So number one,
No,
I mean-
prior. Where
I
you
was
wanted-
just, I was just adding in the third line down after projects, comma, and homework.
Okay, I got that, but you
Okay.
were referring to the last
So-
line where it said cheating, plagiarizing, and examination. Was there any change there?
So number one would read referring to unauthorized materials or devices during a quiz, comma, test, comma, or examination. And then inside the paren, this may include but not limited to the use of cliff notes or whatever it's called now, crib sheets, personal notes, and or unauthorized internet access.
Okay, thank you.
Did I see somebody had a comment, Nora?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt before. I thought the word unauthorized already modified what's in the parenthetical, but unauthorized notes or devices during a quiz or test, which may include, not limited to, unauthorized, all of that stuff is unauthorized, but I mean, the devices during a quiz are authorized or not, depending on the, devices. I just think it's already in there. The unauthorized is modifying the word websites already, or
Okay, so you're just saying take out before
the one that
internet.
was added, the one that was just added the second time we were using the word unauthorized. I think it's already covered by the first use of it as it had previously, but.
Okay, so and or internet access then, without unauthorized.
Okay.
Well, I think it's already there. I think that was the original.
Okay. This may include, okay.
Thanks.
So everybody okay with number one? I'm looking down at my notes and my computer and I don't want to miss anybody who has a comment. Okay. Number two, where it says obtaining copies of a test, I wrote maybe upcoming test, because sometimes teachers will give out past Regents test or past tests as review courses, and I didn't want that to be misinterpreted as cheating. So maybe obtaining copies of an upcoming test. I think that's the intent there. Nora?
Yeah, how about obtaining copies of a test or information about the contents of an upcoming test? The upcoming test is really the second test, right? Because
This is Rachel. Sorry. I can't pull it up on my phone, but I'm wondering if so I don't have it in front of me, so I apologize. But I'm wondering if there's a way to just add one line that deals with all of this, because we're basically jumping through hoops on some of this stuff to try and make clear that obviously if a teacher says any of this is okay, or if it's within the appropriate confines of the class, it's clearly not cheating. So instead of clarifying every single individual clause, maybe we can do it with one line.
Unauthorized material.
I actually like how it's laid out in the 6 points, because it goes on to talk about you're not allowed to alter a grade after a test. You're not allowed to look at another. I mean, it lays out the examples of cheating.
I think the without the teacher's knowledge actually covers the unauthorized obtaining copies of a test or information about the contents of an upcoming test without the teacher's knowledge. Without the teacher's knowledge kind of adds the language that we're looking for item 2. And I think because the next 3 really are different, so it's a good idea, would have been a good idea to have like one overriding term regarding or language regarding unauthorized, but I think 3 through 6 are different.
Yeah. Okay. So can we agree obtaining copies of a test or information about the contents of an upcoming test without the teacher's knowledge? Good. Okay. Any comments about number 3, number 4? Okay, number 5. I had just added in the word examination again. So looking at another student's quiz or test or examination is what I would add. And then for purposes of obtaining answers or information. And then there's a semicolon and it says, or asking another student for the answers. And I would write during exam time, but I don't know if that's necessary.
I think I would not add that, because you could ask for test answers prior to you sitting for the exam because there's multiple sittings.
Yes, thank you. Good point. Great. Okay.
Do we even want to say anything about accessing, stealing, or accepting copies of assessments or answer keys? We don't discuss answer. I mean, if you're going to go to the trouble of all of this, we're not discussing answers. We're just discussing tests. The tests are great, but if you get the answers, it's better.
Okay,
I believe that's covered under number 2. That's contents of an upcoming test.
Oh, contents of a test. Okay, sorry.
Okay. Now I get to the plagiarism paragraph. So plagiarism consists of copying, summarizing, or paraphrasing. It says information. And I thought to cross out information and say another person's thoughts. Just take out the parentheses and take out information in parentheses and just make it another person's thoughts, words, images, or sounds, comma, remove the parenthesis, without giving credit to the original source, comma, and or representing it as your own. Excuse me.
I'm sorry, can I just interject? I'm still not sure what we're doing is addressing Larry's concern why this policy was taken off the original for first reading. Because what we're doing right now is going through a policy that we did already, making tweaks, which is great, but I don't know that we've addressed the concern. So I would prefer, maybe we don't forget that.
We can do that here because, but plagiarism is specifically talking about the person who is actively plagiarizing. In other words, it's defining that it's the person who's actively doing the taking and the borrowing without attribution.
So Larry, are you okay with that? Again, this was put on first reading and I want to make sure we're addressing it.
Again, it depends upon our definition of plagiarism, because again, if somebody knowingly shares something that is plagiarism, they're not doing the plagiarizing, but they're aiding and abetting a plagiarist. But I just want to make sure that is not overly broad as to catch people who are unintentionally being plagiarized against. The example I use, if somebody is given a package of lunch to bring to another student. They bring in, and it turns out that there's contraband in that lunch bag, and they had no idea it was there. Are they guilty of, do they get suspended? It comes into that whole area, and I know that intent, opens up a can of worms, and we have enough lawyers on this board to know that we can have an entire department set up to determine intent. But I think we should be clear that that's what our message is, that we're looking for people who are trying to game the system, not people who are caught up in it.
Okay, Dr. Hines, you had a comment?
I do, and it's along Larry's, because I think part of the reason why we're reviewing this is that, potentially there are students who share their notes not knowing it's going to be copied and then used. I think that's the essence. Larry, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right.
And that person should not be punished if they didn't know it was going to be used by that other student. So I don't know how nuanced we want to get, but knowingly sharing and then just sharing, thinking someone's going to take a look at it to see if their notes align, and then it's used for something else. I think that's part of the problem. That makes sense.
Nora, did I see you had a comment as well?
Yeah, no, I was just, this plagiarism here to me goes more to like writing a paper and not doing the proper citations. Is that, then it's not plagiarizing, copying another student, because you wouldn't say it's said in my friend Jane's paper. I mean, it's more reading, reading something from a source material. And I guess it's just, summarizing or paraphrasing another's thoughts, words. If a student is summarizing the words of a source that they're reading, I could see situations where they're inadvertently doing it and not plagiarizing. I mean, but I don't know how much hair splitting we do. I guess maybe that's within the discretion of the, of the teacher, because I guess if they put it through that program, the program that checks to see if it's copied from somewhere else, I forget what it's called now. There's a process. Turnitin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I guess if it shows up on Turnitin as being plagiarism, then I guess that's probably enough. But I just see a situation where someone, they're not college, they're 10th grade, 11th grade, whatever, where they're writing a paper and they've read like 3 different sources and they're writing, and they don't say, it's become their idea. I mean, I don't mean copying straight out of the book. I'm just concerned about this being too wide of a net for the students.
Yeah,
well, Larry,
didn't this whole thing come up because a student
This was different.
showed a paper to a friend, thought that they were just looking at to get ideas. The friend actually copied the paper, turned it in, caught them as being the same. And
right.
The question, and I believe that they were given rather similar discipline, and that was the part that that brought this whole thing up, and that's the part that I would sort of like to see addressed. Unless, of course, the board doesn't agree, but that's the part that I think as a district, we want to have a philosophy that we're not trying to punish innocent people.
Well, then
I agree, Larry, completely, for what it's worth. And it was an identical punishment.
Right. Well,
right.
We don't want that to happen. So let's figure out how to address that in the policy. Maybe we add an element of intent. Of course, intent is difficult to prove, but what Nora's talking about, inadvertently forgetting to do something, but I think obviously this is on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so I guess that's the answer on that, what I was trying to raise.
And that's also intent. Did you intend to put somebody else's work in as your own, or did it just become part of the common language of the course? There are things, do you have to quote your teacher if your teacher teaches you something?
Okay, Mr.
Jones said 2 and 2 is 4.
Mm-hmm. I want to get to Julie. I want to let the committee members. Larry, I understand you're very passionate about this issue. I get it. I hear it. Let me let Julie speak. Julie, I thought I saw your hand raised somewhere. Did I?
I have a question, yes. So then in regards to what Larry and Dr. Hines were bringing up at that point, it almost comes to a question of collaboration, right? When students are oftentimes, and even in these scenarios, they're collaborating with one another. And when they're taking that collaboration and utilizing it as their own knowingly, you know, I may give my paper to someone or talk to them or review their paper and edit it in collaboration, but now turn it in or it's deemed by the teacher as plagiarism. So how can you word that? So that being a tricky situation, have we consulted any other policies or have we spoken to anyone to see if this matter is covered anywhere else as a reference? Number one. And number two, to Larry's point, he then talks about discipline. Looking to add discipline to this particular policy, or are we just covering this are we just covering policy or academic integrity in this policy?
So just as a reference point, as history, we came up with academic integrity out of code of conduct. So we reviewed code of conduct last year with regards to discipline, and we all agreed that we needed to add an academic integrity policy to try to take away the discipline and and put it back into the integrity of. So that's the reason for all of this. Just for that, so this was kind of a spin-off from code of conduct. Dr. Hines, I think, had a comment. I would just, only because I'm the timekeeper usually, and I just want us to point out that we've been talking about this for 30 minutes and we do have a very hefty agenda. So maybe we can get some action steps.
Dr. Hines, did you have a comment?
Yeah, my only comment was, and again, to what Larry was saying before, I think we're on the same page. The discipline part, I would recommend we stay away from at this moment, but that's something we should certainly address somewhere down the line.
And in answer to your other question, Ms. Epstein, this policy came from another district, and we've adapted it to what we so far think it represents Port Washington.
Thank you.
Okay, I think if we could add intent, but I think we can, you know, when somebody is copying without giving attribution, it's plagiarism. If it's inadvertent, it can be done on a case-by-case basis. I think give the teacher the opportunity, because trying to show that the child had the intent to plagiarize as opposed to an inadvertent is a contextual issue, I believe. So what I wanted to add after that, toward the end of that paragraph, where it talks about obtaining, it says an entire paper or project obtained from another student. Does it have to be a student? Can it be an individual? Can it be a parent? Does it have to be another student? Can we say individual? Yes.
Yes, individual's fine.
Downloaded from the internet or purchased from a paper mill, or I would say, or found in another source. Okay. And then under examination fraud, number 3, it's probably doesn't mean to say altercation of any regent's pass card. So it should be alteration. Take out the C. Does anybody have any other comments?
I just have a question.
Yes.
What is that? Or purchase? I just purchase from a paper mill. That sounds like kind of a outdated term. Did we take that out?
We didn't. I don't know if they still exist.
Well, I just think it sounds like 1990, 1950.
Just say purchased.
I agree.
From any purchase from any source or any purchase, any purchase.
Or we could say purchased or found in another source, or
just purchased or found.
Just purchased. I think that's right.
Purchased.
Purchase, period.
Purchased or found in another source, because it can be.
Well, didn't you say that? Didn't you say that already? Read your sentence again. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I'll read the last part of the sentence. or an entire paper or project obtained from another individual, comma, downloaded from the internet, comma, purchased, comma, or found in another source.
Sounds great.
Okay, good. Any other comments about that?
Okay. Just to refer to the first line again, plagiarism consists of copying, summarizing, or paraphrasing another person's thoughts, words, images, or sounds, period. Was that decided that that sentence was
Comma.
ended there?
Comma,
Okay. Continue.
comma, without giving credit to
Okay.
the source, comma,
Okay.
and or representing.
Okay.
Do we want to add anything that it's addressed on a case-by-case basis? Anybody?
I don't know. You know, when I think of policies, I think of them as an overreaching umbrella, right? They should be case by case anyway. They're just setting a standard. So I don't think you need to go that much detail.
Okay. Do we want to cross-reference the code of conduct? Anybody like that idea? You're shaking your head, yes?
I think if this is how this was born out of, I think that makes sense. It does reference it in the code of conduct, does it not? So I would say.
I think it's the other way around, right? I think code of conduct has to reference this policy because I think, right, Dr. Shields, didn't we just make a spin-off out of this? So I think we would have to reference this policy in code of conduct. Doesn't it? It may.
We did review the code of conduct as part of the process last year.
Right, but through this policy, right? So I think there will probably have to be some sort of cross-referencing to Deborah's point in each of the policies.
Okay, great. So Cindy, you'll add the cross-reference, please, to the code of conduct.
Sure.
So we're putting this back on for first reading?
First reading?
We're going to put the cross-reference in both places, right?
Right, I think I think it needs to go, Rachel, like that.
Yeah, because I think the goal is to make it that if somebody finds one, they know they need to look at the other as well.
Yes, and code of conduct is coming up on one of our agendas this year because it must be reviewed annually, but it's good to know that that has to go in there.
Do we
Okay.
feel? I'm sorry. Do we feel we answered the question that was the reason this was pulled? We feel that that was handled sufficiently?
Yeah,
I
again,
personally
I was
do.
just, as long as we have the intent in there, that I'm fine. That was my original issue with it. So we've gone beyond what I needed, but that's better.
Good, good, okay. Next on the agenda. Dr. Shields, we're going to the pandemic policy, yes.
Yes, at our last month's meeting, we discussed having another conversation about the pandemic policy. But I just want to remind people who are on the committee that on page 16 of our district safety plan, we do have pandemic protocols, which we are obviously following right now. And the language that is in the draft policy that came from NYSBA is similar to that. I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Brooks.
Thank you, Dr. Shields. So this is a draft policy that NYSBA did actually in July of 2020. For those who are listening, which NYSBA does on occasion, they will update their policies. And this was updated specifically to reflect this pandemic. Unfortunately, which is probably the one that has had the most relevance in a school district, I think in certainly in my lifetime. I brought this to Dr. Shields' attention. I'm grateful that he has put it onto the agenda this way. So if we can follow along, I highlighted certain things that NYSBA added that actually kind of encapsulated what I was trying to add at our last meeting. So I don't even need to go over the things I wanted to add. Are we changing the title to contagious disease outbreak planning as we had originally, or do we want to keep it with pandemic planning?
I'm okay with keeping it the way we had originally said it because I think there was a reason for it and I can't remember.
The
Way back
reason for
when.
it, the reason for it is you could have an isolated outbreak that is not
Correct.
qualified as a pandemic. We might want to put in parentheses pandemic because if people are searching, they might search the word pandemic. So we might just want to have it in there as a keyword, but I'm not sure it's actually our title.
Or couldn't we say contagious disease and pandemic planning? Like, couldn't we just add that?
Sure.
And that would,
Yeah, I
right?
mean that would do it as long as that word there, because that's going to be what the community is looking for. But if there's a
Correct.
flu outbreak in Port Washington, it doesn't affect Manhasset. You know, it's not a pandemic, but it's a pandemic to us. So,
I think pandemic means like more than one country, or I mean, it's a broader
Yeah.
term, like epidemic. Is that it?
Yeah.
it has
Yeah.
to do with
It's,
percentage of
it's
spread, I
beyond an
believe.
All we say
epidemic.
is pandemic
Yeah.
these days, but you know, if there's smaller things that are pretty bad, you know.
Right, right.
Right, pan is all.
There
and
could be an
epi is
epidemic in
sport.
New York that we're dealing with.
Right, right.
So how about
So-
contagious disease outbreak and or pandemic planning?
Fine. Let's not get stuck on the title.
Agreed. Agreed. I'm trying. Okay. So obviously our goal all along, which we attempt to communicate to the community on a regular basis, is to reduce the spread of disease among the students and staff so that we can keep our schools open, right? That's what we're in the business of doing. Do we want to put that goal anywhere in the opening paragraph of this policy?
Deborah, did you write something that you'd like to be included? Because if you did, let's read. Why don't
This
you
is
just tell
actually,
us
this
what
is
you
a
want?
comment. This is a comment that Larry made. I actually wrote down his comments from last time. So this is actually, I'm attributing this to Larry.
So
Good,
in
so
the
you're not
beginning where,
plagiarizing.
so there you go, you're not plagiarizing. So are we saying that in the beginning where it says the Board of Education recognizes the public's concern, before that put it is the goal of the Board of Education to
Yes.
educate, blah, blah, blah? Yeah,
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with adding that.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know that anybody would think otherwise, but okay.
Okay, good. So Cynthia, then it would be, it is the goal of the Board of Education to educate the community and in order to reduce the spread of disease among students and staff so that schools may stay open.
I would just change that to, instead of stay open, function properly, but now
Okay,
that I'm
so the
listening.
schools can function properly. It's nice if they can stay open too, but function properly.
It is, but yeah, but that would be sort of an administrative decision, I would guess.
Okay, yes.
I always say students, staff, and families when I make a
Great.
statement about it, because it's really the community, you know, it's for the
Yes.
obvious reasons.
Yes.
Could we use the word stakeholders instead?
Well, sure. So I have a question. So we use employees, community, and students, and we're trying to acknowledge that all of this is in the best interest of those people in the sentence right below the one you're proposing. Would you stay consistent with that language then, or change it to match if you want to include stakeholders?
I understand your point. We surely want consistency. So, best of students. I don't like employees because we usually refer to our staff and the community. So we can keep that language. Is everybody okay with that?
Okay, I was cut off. I apologize. Could you
Okay.
repeat what was said?
So do you have the part about the goal is to reduce the spread of disease among students and staff?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, why don't you read back to me what you have and
Okay. It is the goal of the Board of Ed to educate the community in order to reduce the spread of disease among students and staff so that schools can function properly.
okay. So Julie,
Hold on, I'm sorry. It's the goal of the board to educate the community? I don't know that I agree with that. It's not the goal of the board to educate the community. It's the goal of the board to educate our students. I mean, that we're not the educators of the community.
okay, to educate.
So I just have a question. I mean, I'm just reading the first statement that's already in there. What is the intent and purpose of this policy? The intent and purpose of this policy, if you read the opening statement, is now we are worried about the best interest of our community, our stakeholders, and our students. And so at that function, we are now going to implement direction to our superintendent, which is the intent of a policy, right? And ultimately, by implementing direction to the superintendent, we are then implementing controls that will help to limit spread of such diseases, thereby kind of accomplishing what you're setting out without saying it, right? Is there a redundancy, I guess, in what's happening, in what you're trying to write in this opening goal statement?
I see what Julie's talking about. I don't know that we need that first line again, now that we're reading it through.
Okay.
And like I said, it is not, in my opinion, the goal of the Board of Education to educate the community. It is not our job.
To the extent that the community affects the safety of our students, it is definitely our job to educate the community. We have to educate the community not to go through red lights if they're hitting students. We have to educate the community to do things that protect our students and our staff. It is definitely our job.
Yeah, but
Larry,
honestly,
we don't have
Larry,
policies on that.
and we
Guys, one
don't
at a time,
educate the
one at a
community.
time, one at a time, one at a time.
Right.
Beth?
We educate our community, the school community, not the community at large.
Yes.
So perhaps we could switch that to the school community, because educating the larger community is not, but the school community, I would say
I agree
parents
with that.
and students. So the school community, absolutely.
Okay. So are we saying that someplace?
Well, I think what Julie pointed out is that it may not be necessary. I think the first line, the way it was written is fine. I think we don't need to add that.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Okay. Then the only question is, do we want to change the word employees to staff? Does anybody care?
Sure, no, that's fine. That's fine. You're right.
Okay. Are there any comments on that first page?
I have one. It's Rachel.
Yeah, Rachel?
But I don't know if I'm next in line. If there are other people who wanted to jump in, I'll wait.
I don't see anybody else who has a comment right now.
So I agree with Larry, by the way. I think that we're living this. So we know that an important part of this is educating the school community on what we all need to do as part of our social contract with each other. So I don't have a problem with your line. I also think that the other piece of it that we're not discussing that's important about that line is the schools can continue to function. And I think what we're really getting at is it's so we can continue to educate students no matter what the circumstances are. So I don't know if that line worded a little differently would resonate a little more with the rest of the board. But I'm with Larry. I'm in favor of adding something like that because it's, our central goal is to educate the students. The point of educating our school community and the point of having a policy on how to approach this is so that if we face this circumstance again, we can be hitting the ground immediately, running, and continuing to educate our students with no lapse in the education. That's the goal, right? So that the schools can still function.
So the schools can function, the children can be educated and learn effectively.
Right.
So
So instead of saying function, I would say so that, you know, the schools can continue our central goal of educating the children of this community, something like that.
So how do we synthesize those two sentences so that there's no redundancy?
The whole, can you read your sentence again? Because I'm looking at the pandemic planning policy. I have that in front of me. Your sentence was at the end of it before the board directing, right?
Right. Can I just say what if we're saying that we want to add that it's our goal to educate. So I think if we took that first sentence, the Board of Education recognizes the public's concern over the possibility of a contagious disease outbreak and acknowledges that it is in the best interest of its students, staff, and the community to prepare for such a scenario with the ultimate goal of educating our students, or best educating our students, something to that effect. I think if we added that to the end, I think that would address what you're pointing out, Rachel.
I agree.
That's good. Rachel, what do you think? Rachel, did I lose you? Rachel? Rachel? Okay.
Can you hear me or no?
Yes, now we can, yes.
Sorry, I lost track of whether I was muted or unmuted. Yes, I agree. It sounds good. I might add the word continuing, since hopefully we're already best educating our students. So like continuing.
Continuing.
But I like the suggestion.
Good. Okay, Nora had a comment.
How about continuing to safely educate? Something in there about safety? You know, we want to educate them in this. This is going to help keep the environment safe. So continuing to safely educate our students, or continue to educate our students in a safe environment.
In a safe environment.
That's good. Okay.
Yes.
Cindy, did you get that?
Yes.
Our goal is to maximize having more children in school. There's no question. Okay. On the second page, I had some comments, but does anybody have comments before I add mine? No hands are up? Okay. So in the third bullet, it talks about establishing liberal, non-punitive attendance. What do you think about adding and alternative learning opportunities? Somewhere I want to combine alternative learning opportunities, liberal assignment and homework, exam makeup. This is also incorporating the notes I took from Larry's comment from last time. These are Larry's thoughts that I wrote down and was bringing back. Because I know in an article I read from NISPA that when we're in circumstances such as this, it's incredibly stressful on the students. They shouldn't be punished for not being able to attend school if they're sick or if they're quarantined and something happens in the home. And the district should be understanding, I guess the word is liberal, with respect to assignment, homework, exam makeup, etc. So is there a way
do you have suggested wording, Deborah? Do you have suggested wording?
Well, I would propose, so that bullet would read, establishing liberal, non-punitive attendance, assignment, homework, and exam makeup policies for students unique to an outbreak of contagious diseases. Julie has a question.
Could we, I just concern ourselves with pigeonholing and being that specific. Would it be okay if we just put policies? And then that way, if as they arise, would that be specific enough?
We could say non-punitive attendance and other policies?
Or just,
When
I don't,
this,
Is it
NISBA has in here attendance. And there
Yes.
was a requirement that the attendance policies actually be modified during the pandemic. So I sense that NISBA wants us to keep attendance in here.
I know,
Don't we all think, haven't we all learned a lesson that attendance policy should be modified, period? We don't want sick kids in school, and having punitive attendance policies should just go away in general. Like, I feel like that's a lesson learned. So I don't know if we need to be that specific. Like, I just think we should modify attendance policies so sick kids
So-
don't come to school.
I think the point though is the way NISBA's placed. So what I think Julie's saying is establishing non-punitive attendance and participation policies. So I think non-punitive participation, in other words, if there's a student who can't do their homework or can't do a makeup, I think that's the point of not being specific. So if you're not penalized for attending or for participating, I think that kind of makes it a generalized. I do want to say the word liberal bothers me, and
So just take out
because
liberal?
we're communists.
I'm not afraid of the word liberal.
But I think it means something else in this case as opposed to just establishing liberal. I think it's saying
Well,
being
non-punitive-
flexible. I think it's flexible, right? I think establishing flexible, non-punitive attendance and participation policies
Yes.
for students unique to an outbreak of a contagious disease and/or pandemic. I think we should add that, and/or pandemic. So I think it's flexible, which is liberal, but not
let's-
nowadays.
But I would go, but back
I think
to Julie's
flexible
point,
is
can't
better.
we just say policies? Do we have to say, right, flexible, non-punitive?
Oh, correct.
Do we have
correct.
to say attendance
Well,
or
we could-
participation? Can we just
Yeah, we
say
could say
policies?
flexible.
Policies.
Yes. So it should be establishing flexible, non-punitive policies for students unique to an outbreak of contagious diseases and/or pandemic.
Are
Good.
they policies or practices or regulations?
How can we say how about policies and practices? Policy, because there's
Policies
two
and
different,
regulations.
Right.
yeah, or regulations, whatever.
Cindy, you got all that?
Establishing flexible, non-punitive
Policies
policies
and regulations
regulations for
For students
students unique to an outbreak of contagious diseases and/or pandemic, or pandemic. Are we ending at pandemic?
Yeah.
And or a pandemic.
Sorry, say that
It's
again.
Rachel.
And or a pandemic.
Okay.
I have a comment whenever we're done, we're ready.
Go ahead, Rachel.
So I just want to remind, myself, everybody, all of us, because I'm always thinking about, what are our goals when we craft policy? And I think, yes, we don't want to be so specific that it doesn't make sense, because that's not a great way to craft policy, because you want to be able to have a policy work in many circumstances into the future. But you're also a little bit laying foundation for what is to come. And often when you're crafting policy, it's because you've had a circumstance that led you to understand the need for the policy, and future boards and future administrations may not have that. And hopefully we won't have another pandemic for a very, very long time. All that said, I actually am in favor of adding a little more specificity, but I think that we could do it in a way that is more open-ended, which I think some of the board would prefer. The reason I would add it is because I think we've lived through this. So we now understand that attendance and class assignments and all of these things and grading do need to be liberal in a pandemic. We've already lived it. So maybe there's a clause that we could add at the end of the sentence that's, including but not limited to, or administration should look at policies including but not limited to attendance, homework, grading, exams, whatever else we think should be in the list. So we're not drawing the circle too small, but we're signaling the future that these are some of the things that they should be thinking about, because we've now learned the hard way about these things.
I like that. What do other people think?
So okay, if to Rachel's suggestion, so then why after that initial statement that we just all kind of wrote, then perhaps we should add some policies or some, including but not limited to, and then just add like, some policies could be but are not limited to, or some areas to be flexible in, some areas to be flexible in could be but are not limited to attendance, homework, blah, blah. To what Rachel said. I mean, I don't think we should be as specific. And I think it is better to be general, as Larry says, and have regulations. And regulations are not ours. Regulations are then the districts, Mike's basically, to handle. So I think that's the differences in policy. So the board sets a policy, the administration sets, then based on our policy, sets regulations that they follow. So we may be getting a little into the specifics of regulations, but it's up to everybody.
Julie, you had
Mike, I don't know.
Can I ask Dr. Hines?
Thank you. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I always found when the policy is hyper-specific, it handcuffs, I think, the administrator's ability to do things and be flexible. So I think if there's some balance, which it sounds like we're trying to find, I think that's most appropriate.
So are there any policies that you would like enumerated in this policy, or would you like us to not include any? So for example, NISBA has included attendance. Would you like attendance to stay in there, or do you prefer do you recommend the more generic policy?
I happen to like the more generic, the better. But I will say this: I do like NISBA's policy, their sample policy. I think there's a lot to glean from that we can incorporate. I wouldn't say all of it, but some of it for sure. But I would say in this instance, the more general we are, I think the better off we are. And to Rachel's point, we have learned a lot. There is no doubt we have learned a lot for sure. I just don't want to handcuff ourselves too much. So if we can find a happy medium between the two, I would be happy with that.
Julie, you have a comment?
Yes. So I hear what Rachel's saying. I don't disagree, but balancing that not being handcuffed, right? This is a policy. We also are not just looking at this, remember, as a pandemic policy, which is what the intent of it was when it was originally written. We've now added contagious diseases, which include the flu, include strep. So now if we have an outbreak of strep of, I don't even know what that means, 10 people, do we have to consult this policy, and have we handcuffed ourselves too much if we're too specific? Right? I mean, that's the other side of the coin.
It's an interesting point, but let's say an entire class is out with the flu. I mean, you don't want to penalize them for not being well. And I would argue that some kids who have the flu are actually feeling much better than asymptomatic kids who have COVID-19. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but
I think we have to remember that all these words have meanings. So an outbreak is a sudden localized incidence of a disease. That can become an epidemic if the spread becomes more severe and it's a wider area. And then that can become a pandemic when we're talking about crossing country borders. So I don't think we've ever had what we would consider here an outbreak of strep or an outbreak of flu, although I'm sure way back Fort Washington had outbreaks of flu, where we're talking about the major flu epidemics. I think this policy to me only comes into play when it rises to the level of an outbreak. You're not talking about a bunch of kids are out of school with the flu like they are every year. You're talking about when it rises to the level of the Spanish flu.
Can I comment?
Nora, sure.
Why don't we say epidemic and pandemic? Because we're really like a flu epidemic we're talking, not isolated cases. We're not talking about 4 kids getting strep, which of course isn't an issue, but then let us go home. You know, like there's other things in place. We're really talking about epidemics and pandemics, I think. I mean, there's plenty of contagious diseases that we've been dealing with perfectly, you know, fine with the policies that have been in place. This is really for something like we're currently experiencing, or something that was more limited, say, to the East Coast, you know, but I think it's really epidemic would cover and not go too far beyond what we do want to cover here with this policy.
Not only that, Nora, I agree. And that's why I was sort of saying with the liberal attendance policy, right? If we think back to February, we're using our experience here, and we think back to February when we were encouraging parents not to send their kids to school. There was no pandemic, there was no epidemic. But if we had more liberal attendance policies, that may have helped, you know, not we, Port Washington, but we as a world may have helped the spread of disease. So that's where I was saying, like, I think we need to take our experiences here and look at broader based things.
And it's also clearly related to when school is severely disrupted. It's and the community.
I like Nora's addition of epidemic. I mean, what if I think she's talking about the title, right, Nora? So I think if the title is contagious disease outbreak, epidemic, and pandemic policy or something like that.
No, I think Rachel, I think Nora's suggestion was to take out contagious disease and just call it an epidemic and pandemic policy, which I think is correct.
That was my.
I think that's what Nora said.
I was
sorry. I did get that. I would leave outbreak in because that covers if there is something that is Long Island or just Port Washington as well. Because we do want to just cover our bases on a policy.
But wouldn't that just be a contagious? Wouldn't that be an epidemic if it's just on Long Island? It would be an epidemic. I mean, I think that's the difference.
I don't think so.
There's a definition of epidemic somewhere.
Okay, let's not get caught up on this.
No, I got the definition of epidemic open. It's a widespread occurrence of infectious disease in any community at a particular time.
Okay.
I knew that.
How about contagious disease epidemic and or pandemic?
No, because the common cold is a contagious disease. You know, I mean,
epidemic, right. I think the suggestion is epidemic and pandemic. So Cynthia, it would go back to every time we have contagious disease. I think it would be a change to an epidemic or pandemic.
Okay, so it's being called epidemic or pandemic.
And or pandemic policy. Or and we don't need the or.
We don't need the or. I'm big on and or, but I don't think we need it in there.
Okay, so it's just being called epidemic and pandemic policy.
Correct.
Okay.
Larry had a comment there.
Yeah, so the bigger issue, and the reason I think it's not bad to have contagious diseases in there, is right now a lot of people come to school when they're not feeling well because they're afraid of any penalties of what they might miss or how it may affect their GPA and how it will affect their entire future life because they didn't, get the same grade. And I think we'd like to sort of deal with that so that we don't even look, if 5 extra kids get something because somebody came into school when they were sick, that's a problem for those 5 people. So
Larry, that was my point. We need to change the attendance policy in general.
But not just the attendance policy, because it also reflects the homework policy, the test policy, the makeup policy. It affects the way we deal with students when they're not in school. Across the board.
I think that's as part of other policies. I don't think that's as part of, we're looking at pandemics and epidemics, not necessarily this. That's why I didn't want to be so specific to say attendance policy here or homework or participation policy, because clearly all of those things have to be looked at in the midst of a pandemic. But what I was saying, if we think back to February when we were begging people to keep their kids home if they had signs of, a cold or a cough or a fever, we were begging people to keep their kids home. We were not in a declared pandemic or epidemic yet. And so that's where we need to look at our policies as a whole. That's where I think we need to take what, as Rachel said, we learned a lot from this. And what we learned is, school attendance is not, like these things, these kinds of policies that we've had are not good.
then
It's not
maybe we
good to
should
be
add,
encouraged stuff like that.
maybe that should get added on as a topic later on in the year to look at the more global policies
Agreed.
and
It's on.
as sort of as the pandemic is going to make us reflect on a lot of our policies.
The attendance policy is on our wish list of things to review. It is coming up.
Okay.
I think that's the global point that we all need to take away, right?
Okay. On the second page, the fifth bullet down where it talks about the process for communicating information. So the first line reads, developing a process for communicating information concerning the outbreak of an epidemic or pandemic to the school community on a continuing basis. We had discussed last time that language might want to be in there that says as fully and promptly as possible, or with as much transparency and promptly as possible. Does anybody have any feelings about that?
I don't know that. I think
Promptly as possible is fine. The word transparency, you all know how I feel about that.
And I think if you add it here, you have to go back over every policy and say, I mean, we always want to be as transparent as possible. That's
No, we don't.
No,
Don't lie.
actually, Julie and I were on a workshop yesterday of communicating in the pandemic, and the three things you needed to be was consistent, transparent, and prompt. You're muted, and you take better notes than me.
It was consistent, clear, and concise.
Consistent, clear.
See, no word transparent there, Larry. Consistent, clear, and concise. That I agree.
But clear, transparent, and clear are synonyms.
They are.
So-
Yeah.
I think we want to be robust.
The undertone was that, yes, transparent. Tell them what you know. Bring the curtain down, so to speak. But
So-
again, this is a policy.
I like clear.
This is a policy, so I don't. Do we? Again, I don't like to handcuff or pigeonhole us anywhere. And as long as we develop a process for communicating, then how that process, then within that process, there should be the words prompt and
Correct.
clear.
I think that's something you throw into regulations as opposed to policy. And because, to some people, they would read that and say, so I want to know that, the person at Manor Haven was in Mrs. Smith's class and sat in the third row, second seat, and my daughter was 7 feet away from them. To some people, that would be transparent. So that's where I think we just have to be careful with the words that we use, because we just do.
That also violates privacy rights.
Correct.
So,
but that's
that,
what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. We have to be
transparent
careful.
obviously can't. I think the community understands we can't violate that. So
And we could add that too without violating any, student confidentiality.
Deborah, do you read the emails? Because I'm not so sure people understand that we can't violate privacy.
do I read what email? I read everything.
I'm being facetious. We've gotten many emails
the
asking
emails
questions
that we-
with more specifics.
Yes, I understand. You. I was looking for emails and I didn't see any. Okay. Can we add something in there about where we develop, or I guess Julie is saying the process. I think we need to give guidance as to what should be included in the process. It needs to be timely, transparent without violating privacy, consistent. We're supposed to give guidance. Supposed to give our,
I think, but it depends on, I guess what I struggle with is some of the stuff. For example, there were a lot of times that I would say we provided information, and I'm going to send all of you an email about some information that we provided that turned out to be inaccurate because we acted before, say, the government acted or the CDC acted. So I think we have to just be careful about how and what kind of guidance that we give, because it really is, there's a lot of science and things that come out and things that we follow and things we read in the news and things that we may think are important. So I just want to be very careful, because somebody's prompt is somebody else's rushed, and it's somebody else's not fast enough.
okay.
Rachel, can you mute? Thank you.
So communicate information.
Remember, our purpose of the policy also, we're the what, and the district is the how. So when we say what, it's develop a process for communication, and they come back and they tell us the how, right? So in line, as long as that bullet, our what can say, it includes a little bit of a how. Such efforts may include preparing an information letter for distribution, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, we're just writing a policy of the what.
Yes, but we can,
Correct.
but we can, as a board, insist that things be done in a timely manner, things be done consistent.
But I guess my thing is, how do you evaluate timely? Because everybody's that was my point. Everybody's timely is different. It just is. In many bureaucratic worlds, timely is after 7 studies come out. Now we can say timely, even though the news is reporting it after the first one. So I think we just have to be careful.
Furthermore, I think that it's a responsibility of the board, if we've put in this policy to develop a process for communication, then the how of how the district has done that communication and implement it, then we can come back if we're in disagreement with it and hold them accountable to a certain level and revamp from there. That's within the process and the roles of our governance, and still included within this policy, right?
I understand that, but I guess it's better to be prepared rather than having to go through that and have to come back and fix it. Maybe set some understanding for accountability at the outset. But I don't have to belabor the point. I
agree with you, Deborah. I think that you're right here. I mean, Julie, you're right overall on the framework, but it seems it's better for the board, better for the community, better for the administration if we use policy to set clear expectations beforehand instead of engaging in, some back and forth. And I think, the language you and Larry both just cited from this workshop, I forgot what the first word was, but clear and concise prompts, I think, clear and concise. Policy is supposed to be our goals, our aims, our instructions to the administration. And if we have certain ideals that we want to codify, that we expect the community to be communicated with clearly and in a timely fashion, and in a way that's understandable, I don't see the harm in having that be in a policy. In fact, I think it's good for future administrations. This policy is not for this board and this administration because we have now lived it and talked about it and worried about it. And I think that we're getting there. But I think, Beth, I see your concern, but I think that language still allows a lot of wiggle room for the administration to interpret the how, as Julie just said, the how of the communication, but the board is well within its rights to have expectations in policy that communication will achieve a certain level.
Okay, so can I suggest that we say developing a process for communicating clear, concise, and what was the third word, Julie? Information concerning the outbreak of a epidemic and or pandemic. What was the third word, Julie? Clear, concise, and consistent. Okay, so I think to Rachel and everyone else's point and to Beth's point, I think those 3 words kind of set the tone to what Deborah was saying, but it does not limit. It doesn't say how we're going to be doing that. It's just saying what we expect. So would we all be okay with developing a process for communicating a clear, concise, and consistent, or communicating clear, concise, and consistent information concerning the outbreak of an epidemic and or pandemic to the school community on a continuing basis, period.
I'm okay
Is
with
that
that.
okay with everyone? Rachel?
I like your overall point. I just would rephrase it because I think it's communicating clearly, concisely, and what was the third word?
Consistently.
Yeah,
And
I agree
And
with you.
consistently. That's
It's
what
the
those words are supposed to be
communication.
about. They're about the communication.
Right.
You're all just such lawyers here. Okay, thank you. Yes, good.
Cindy,
This is
we
how we
got-
end up with well-drafted policies.
There you go. There you go.
Cindy, you good with that?
Yes, I am.
Okay, awesome. Okay, put this on for, does it go on for a first reading? Is that right?
Would you
Someone
like us to bring it back to the committee, or would you like it to go to first reading?
Should we, Emily, I'm going to defer to you as the,
I think we should bring it, I just knowing the way this board has been operating and we bring things to reading and then we bring it back. I think if we could just bring it back to the committee to read and make sure we're all okay with the wording and then put it on a first reading. That would be my suggestion.
happy to defer to your expertise. And I just
Thank
want
you.
to say, in the schools, in the school safety district plan, there's this thing called the influenza, I don't know if people can see it, but it's called the influenza pandemic. The whole pandemic policy prior to this was really based on influenza. And so much of this doesn't help us right now. But anyway, okay. I'm going to poll the committee. We have a bunch of other policies on the agenda. I did not get to community comments last time, and I see that chat is disabled for this live stream. There are 9 people watching. Do we plow on with media relations, which social media policy, which is on next, or do we direct people to email if they have public comments? Or because there are 9 people watching, and I think I'm one of them.
Deborah, again, I think I'm one of them too. So and I think actually Julie was watching as well. So we may be like more than 50% of them. Why don't you suggest that people do the email of community comments? If we get any, we can address them. If not, we can at least just continue on with the business. That would be my suggestion.
As Beth suggested, if you have any community comments, please feel free to email them to the Board of Ed. And if you could put in your heading, community comments, policy and personnel, that would be helpful. So we know it could be a public document if necessary and not necessarily confidential that you want to share with the board.
Deborah, give the email address.
Oh, I thought I did. I'm sorry. At BOE@portnet.org. Thank you. So the next policy up on the agenda, I'm just going to jump in, is media relations. There's an updated version from NISBA that was
Social
not,
media, it's a social media, not media
Oh, I'm
relations.
sorry, yes.
Social media
Our-
policy.
Our policy says social media policy. The policy that's up there now, 1130, is from 1992. Just this morning, I don't know how or why, but I found an updated version from NISBA from 2011. There may even be one that's more current, but I had written to Dr. Shields and asked his guidance on whether we should go forward with this revision of the media relations policy. I think we're conflating 2 policies. One is media relations as it relates to the newspapers and who speaks to the newspapers and that chain. And the other is actually board members acting on social media. Emily, I see you shaking your head. So I am happy to put the media relations policy 1130 aside until we can get the new NISBA update uploaded. And to move forward with the social media policy, but that's really from scratch. Emily, did you want to speak?
Yes, I do, because I think you're absolutely correct. I also found the updated media relations policy from NISBA, which I swear I thought we had done. I'm totally thought we had somewhere because the updated media relations policy adds wording with regards to who is the spokesperson of the board. And that policy says that the board president is the spokesperson of the board. That is certainly something that we as a board have been operating under as our day-to-day. We've gone as far as say, the board president or their designees, and the board president has made generally her his or her vice president or president as their designees, but we've done this. So I don't know why it's not in our policy. I really thought we had one, and maybe somewhere there's another policy where we do talk about, right? So now NISBA brings back everything. I would suggest that we update our media relations policy that to include the board president's designee. I think we have that also written in our board like president job, right? Isn't it that in one of our other, right?
It's in one of the policies that talks about the
Right. So,
responsibilities of the president.
but
And
it's fine. So
they're
then we could always, right. So then we would put that back in as a cross-reference to no problem adding that. And I think that this is then the opportunity to add, as NISBA suggests, something in media relations that talks about that it is the board president who is the spokesperson for the board on social media outlets as well. And that there is, no, and then it becomes another discussion for us about what about everybody else, who can say what. Board, Nora, Tag, you're in. So I think what might be good then.
I'm going to go on social media right now.
Go ahead and say, I'm speaking, nobody talk. So I think also then with this 10:57 a.m. being our time that we're supposed to be ending at 11, maybe what we should agree is that at the next meeting, we have the updated media relations policy brought in and we can make our changes. Or Deborah, in interest of time, we can add the paragraph that we're talking about right now, because it's really just one paragraph, and then we can ask for it to be brought back to the board for further discussion. I could read it quickly. It's just one quick paragraph. It's your choice.
Well, based on my experience from our last meeting, I know that the committee members like to have the sample policy in front of them, and the community might like to see the sample policy. So rather than running through this paragraph, because there are other things I think that were added from this paragraph and updated in the news media relations, my preference would be to let everybody have the same document that you and I have and Dr. Shields has, and the public certainly, and then proceed with that at the next meeting. But I would say, I think there's this extra paragraph does make clear that individual board members are permitted to speak. They just have to be sure that they are saying we are not speaking on behalf of the board. So I think where we think about talking about social media and media relations, I think those are distinctions, because most of us know not to talk to the newspapers on behalf of the board, but a lot of us are on social media. Like, we're not talking to the newspapers on a daily basis or at all, but we are on social media on a daily basis. So let's hold this off. Let's make sure that we have, if there's a version that's even more current than the 2011 version from NISBA, then we make sure we have that version. And then we start off there, if that's okay with the rest of the committee, in deference to individuals not having that policy before them. And then we can end on time. Yes? Do we have consensus? Okay. Dr. Shields, A-okay?
Sounds good. Yes, we will bring it back next meeting.
Great.
Dr.
Okay.
Shields, can I also ask that we add on to and I can send it to you, but just there's a fact sheet about board from NISBA with regards to board member facts for social media. It's more of a guidance than it is. It's not in the policy that we're talking about. It's just, so I don't know if you have it or if Deborah had sent it to you, but if you do not, I'll be more than glad. Let's add that also in the conversation topic for next time.
Yes, if you send that to me and Cindy, we will make sure it's
Sure.
included in the backup for next month.
No problem.
What I had was a pamphlet that I kind of downloaded, and it's teeny
That's
tiny.
it. Yeah, it's a 2-page pamphlet. Is that the one you have? Yeah. So that's so Deborah, will you send that, or do you want me
Yes,
to send it?
I should have, and I neglected to, but I will, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, without further ado, so our next meeting is November 18th. We tend to have a very ambitious agenda, which is a good thing because we want to accomplish a lot. But these are some very meaty subjects that obviously warrant due consideration and attention. So thank you to the committee members and to the board members for your participation. If anyone, Emily, I was just about to adjourn, but go ahead.
No,
You're
I
no longer.
do you
That's okay.
feel like yourself from last year? Because every time I was about to adjourn.
I have no problem. I can go on. So take your
No,
best
I
shot.
just want, I just want to point out that we had 3 other policies that we were supposed to be talking about today that we did not. And so I just want to make sure that we carry them over into the first topics for next meeting. That's all.
Yes, and one of them is the chain of command, which does help community members. It's policy 1400. We do actually have a chain of communication in the district, and so if anybody wants to refer to that until we get to it, it's there on the books. So, okay, anybody else? Okay, without further ado, we are adjourned until November. Everybody stay safe. Stay safe.
Thank you all.
Kids in school. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.